Good morning. Today is Tuesday, January 21st, 2020. It is 9:30 and it is a regularly scheduled meeting of the Los Angeles Board of Police Commissioners. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Good morning. Let the record reflect Commissioners Decker, Murphy, Goldsmith, and Bonner are present, and we have a quorum.
Thank you very much. We'll just go to the regular agenda items. The first item is the department's report relative to the third quarter report on homelessness. Commander Graham.
Good morning, Commander.
Good morning, ma'am.
Thank you for the report, as always. Unless other commissioners feel differently, we all read the report. We don't need the long summary. Of course, commissioners can ask questions, but of course, ma'am. Always appreciate the thoroughness of this, and I am seeing, as you know, we have for a couple of years now, positive trends in terms of reducing arrests and citations for status offenses for people doing things that they are only doing because they're experiencing homelessness. I am really concerned about the increase in uses of force against people experiencing homelessness, as well as the increase in the victimization of people experiencing homelessness. So I wonder if you could provide some analysis for us about how the department is decriminalizing homelessness and what the results of that are, and in particular the two trends in terms of increased victimization and increased uses of force.
Yes, ma'am. So let me start with the use of force piece. As you can see from the number, the increase in use of force, in the third quarter of 2019, uses of force against persons experiencing homelessness represented 35% of the overall number of uses of force by the department, which is a 5% increase over the last quarter year. And this includes 5 categorical uses of force, including 1 law enforcement related injury, 1 in custody death, 1 that was directed by the chief of police for investigation, a head strike, and an officer involved shooting. So in my first primary goal, which is the establishment of a common operating picture across the department, we're continuing to go out into roll calls and senior lead officer meetings, detective squad meetings, physically my staff and I in the department, within the department, in order to raise awareness of the necessity for utilizing all of the de-escalation tools and, when appropriate, MHIT tools that have been provided to our force when they encounter people experiencing homelessness. This is a population that, simply by the nature of their being, has a much higher instance of the potential for mental illness. And as I have read in many studies, yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry. I need to ask the members of the public to kindly keep their remarks to themselves until public comment. It's very hard to hear the report, so I would ask for your cooperation with that. Commander?
Thank you. As I have personally read in studies, in as little as 7 days, a person who's living in a state of homelessness can begin to experience states of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that mental illness piece looms as much largely a factor in the use of force piece, as well as the increased contacts between the members of the department and persons who are experiencing homelessness, as the demand for action about encampments ramps up both in the community and from other sources of elected officials within the city. as it goes to the victimization of homelessness and the increase in the number of victims that are homeless, the first thing, as I said in my first report as the commander in charge of the Homeless Coordination Office, I'm paying very close attention to any trends or patterns that are occurring either geographically or by MO when it comes to people experiencing homelessness. I am very concerned about the potentiality for vigilantism to occur in the city. And as of this point, in my communications with my peers at the Operations Bureau level, we don't see that trend happening, although the increase in the number of victims being double digit, the commonality there is the increase in population. Unfortunately, the point in time increase in population was a double-digit increase last year, and it is relatively correlating to the double-digit increase that we have in victimization. As many of you know, tonight is the start of the new point in time count by the county. I will be volunteering in my community for the first time to participate in the point in time account, to pitch in and do my part in my community, and also to see firsthand how we go about the accumulation of this information. So we are, as we move forward, I want to take a look as a ComStat item, and I have discussed this with my boss, Chief Arcos, taking a look at clearance rates by detectives for crimes that are associated with victims experiencing homelessness, and ensuring that the clearance rates of those crimes either match the clearance rates for housed individuals who are victims of crime, or at least we can substantiate that we are as tenaciously going after every lead that we can to put those people in custody, to bring justice to our homeless neighbors as we are when people are housed. So we'll be focusing on that piece in this coming year. We're also going to be focusing on, as I said in my first report in this job, the training of the officers throughout the department to have a common understanding as to the appropriate applications of 5611, 4118, and 85.02, which currently stands in a moratorium. So that as we continue to stabilize the common operating picture across the department as to what does it mean to be services led? What does it mean to have enforcement as a last resort? And we have these conversations in roll call. We begin to put the DNA into our patrol officers and not just rely on the expertise of Hope and Reset and the senior lead officers as our point enforcement and point contact folks with people experiencing homelessness. As I said during my second quarter report, I think that one of the trends that we're seeing is the increase in reporting of property crimes where a person experiencing homelessness is the victim. And you say, well, what might the relevance be of that? Well, I think we can all anecdotally agree that property crimes are underreported in the normal population. They would be much more so in a population that didn't trust the police. As we see these reports increasing, go back a step, as we continue our efforts to do outreach and build relationships with people in the homeless population, their willingness to come forward and report these issues to the police, I think, is reflected in those numbers.
Can you say more about the efforts to decriminalize homelessness and what you're seeing even more? Now that you've taken over and you're doing so much in terms of partnerships and operationalizing this philosophy of enforcement as a last resort, what results do you expect to see as a result of really making sure that officers internalize the services-led enforcement as a last resort philosophy?
Well, first of all, as far as actions that were taken during the report, we had touched on it in my last presentation, but this is the quarter where it actually happened, and the department in partnership with the city attorney and the district attorney, filed motions to dismiss 803,388 open infraction citations and recall almost 150,000 warrants, and to suspend fines and fees for 142,526 post-conviction infraction citations. This was done in order to remove the burden of these past convictions on individuals so that they can feel free to interact with services. I know a lot of the the individuals that are experiencing homelessness that understand that these things are looming in the horizon are very hesitant to come forward and answer the call, especially when approached by a police officer. Our partnership with the development company that is developing the Get Help app, we think is also going to take us further down that path. One of the executives from that, Tony, is here today if you'd like to talk to him about what his company is developing. But the really exciting part about working with them is their ability to overcome what I think is one of the most heartbreaking things about watching these systems develop. And as I have had inputs from a variety of different resource providers, the number one reason a person experiencing homelessness falls out of the matriculation for getting services is the failure to fill out the forms properly. And in 2020, where we can change the temperature of our homes from our cell phones, there has to be a technology bridge to that piece. And that's what the Get Help people are working on. So as officers in the street are conducting intake interviews and actually concierge matching people up to services throughout this county of Los Angeles, they can also utilize that same technology to push the application forms ahead of them as they provide transportation to those pieces. And that's what a services-led orientation looks like. And that application is not just applicable to police officers, but every person out there that has a city seal on their car that goes about doing their business every day can be approached by someone experiencing homelessness and say, I've had it, I need help. And they can access that same information on their mobile device and utilize the Get Help app to connect them to services. They might not be able to provide the transportation, but we can have that's a discussion we can have when we get down to that path. And that, I believe, is what a real no wrong door policy looks like in the city of Los Angeles. So between training, messaging, and then working with technology fixes, we're going to continue forward on a services-led approach. When enforcement becomes the last resort, we're actively working with the city attorney's office to look for post-booking or pre-booking diversion programs. Just like they have in juveniles, looking for opportunities to intercept an individual who's experiencing homelessness. And I think that the statistics that I looked at with our jail in-reach program support the fact that that would work. There's 68% of people who are approached by the InReach program have decided to at least talk to a service provider, which is twice as high as the normal street level interaction. So I think that if we can get some programs that look for either that pre-booking diversion, or we can capitalize with the system that already exists in the jails, and do in-reach to the jails. The problem there is consistency of programming to provide support for our jail personnel to actively continue this program. While we have a dedicated senior detention officer who I met, who's very visionary about how he wants to interact with people experiencing homelessness who get booked in our jails, there's an inconsistency in program providers to come in behind them to offer those services. So the last thing in the world that we want to do is offer false hope to people who have already been dealt the hand that they've been and find themselves in a state of homelessness and in custody. So training, communication, technology, and then the utilization of the justice system for procedural justice, I think, are the ways that we're going to move forward in 2020 and continue to double down on our services-led and enforcement as a last resort approach.
Great. I would like to see in future reports an analysis of your work to do more pre-booking diversion. I mean, the department has done so much recently to address the post-conviction issues that you mentioned, open warrants and fines and fees and all of the consequences when people are put into the system. I think the department has been very proactive in addressing that, including jail in-reach and the re-entry process. But it's really the LAPD that's pulling people into that system in the first place, and then we have to provide, invest tremendous amounts of resources to untangle them from the system that this department has put them into. So I would like to see more work to just stop that influx and prevent people from getting arrested and put in the system in the first place. I think we would see great cost savings as well as the outcomes of people's lives dramatically improving.
Happily.
And that's, that's not even, it's good to offer services, although we know that there are not enough services and housing for the people experiencing homelessness. So just not bringing them into the system, not arresting them, not citing them is probably more of a benefit even than offering services that, as you said, are inaccessible for a number of reasons. And lastly, could you address, I'm very glad to see the positive decision that the department's no longer engaging in enforcement around fair evasion on the trains, but could you just sort of state that?
Certainly,
for
at first,
the public?
is Transit Services Group? After the presentation for the second quarter report and these numbers came to light, a discussion occurred between the Office of Operations and Transit Services Group and the discovery of that policy of pushing for the fare evasion. Chief Chow changed that policy in September, and if I may reference my notes, I know that the number of citations that were given for fare evasion through the successive months went down to in the hundreds in the first 2 months of the quarter, and then 10 in October. And those numbers persisted throughout, as you'll see in the fourth quarter report, those numbers persisted throughout the fourth quarter report. So more onus is being put on MTA as an entity to conduct those enforcement actions so that LAPD doesn't have the burden of having to go through that.
Thank you, appreciate that. All
Yes,
right.
ma'am.
Good morning, Commander.
Good morning, ma'am.
One procedural question. I would hope you can make some efforts to ensure that we receive these reports on a more timely basis. This is the third quarter of last year, and we've already received some information about the end of year statistics, and it would seem that we should be able to get these reports in a more timely manner. And I would ask you and your team to ensure that that starts happening.
Yes, ma'am. I take responsibility for that, and we will make sure that doesn't happen again.
Appreciate it. I'd like you to address, sir, if you would, my interpretation, which could be wrong, and if so, please correct it, that referrals from the HOPE team to LASA have gone down. And in looking at last quarter's report, I pulled up the second quarter report that we received for 2019, and there were 234 in the second quarter, and this quarter there were only 108. And obviously that's a very significant drop. I wonder if you can explain it. I should say in context. I see some of the other numbers have gone up, and I don't know if it's in the end a zero-sum gain. I don't quite understand why those referrals would go down since the HOPE teams are so active and those referrals are so important.
So one of the things there's two pieces to that puzzle. One is a procedural issue. We get those numbers reported to us from LASA, and LASA has begun to stop counting duplicates. So if Don Graham is in the field and gets referred to LA HOP prior to 2019 and then gets referred to LA HOP again, there's 2 entries in LA HOP, and they would report that back to us as 2 referrals. So now that they've been able to tease out duplicates, that number is greatly reduced. Secondly is the department's conscious step backwards in allowing LASA to take the lead in field contacts in both the areas of referrals and in the areas of street contacts. So as we, and as you'll see in the fourth quarter report with the implementation of CARE and the appointment of LASA outreach workers to be the point outreach in the CARE team configurations, that number will continue to decline. And then what we're hoping to see is that as our training and as our messaging goes out to our field personnel, that number will, the number you're going to see on the chart there is specific to HOPE Team's reset, but that department-wide will see an increase in those referrals as police officers working patrol become more comfortable interacting with the homeless provider system.
And is that why there's an asterisk by that number?
Yes,
in
ma'am.
the report? Okay. I understand that now.
Hey, Commissioner, I want good morning and apologies for my tardiness. I want to clarify that the referral process, though, the officers are there. They're there as a safety element for all involved. So it's not that LASA has been detailed out for this and they're doing the referrals and we're doing something else. It is a multidisciplinary team, and the interaction between the individual experiencing homelessness and the outreach worker is what, in concert with LASA, coordination with them, they're asking for greater reliance on that than on us. We will still have referrals with HOPE teams that are frequently deployed without the support of LASA because of their unavailability. So you'll see that.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you both. And Commander, you may have already answered this question, but I want to be sure we have the total perspective. I'm wondering what other trends you are seeing. You talked earlier about trends in property crimes. I wonder if you can just give us a broad overview of the trends that you're seeing, both positive and negative.
So unfortunately, in the negative sense, I mean, there's an increase in Part 1 crime across the board. In just about every division in the city, we're seeing an increase in crime related to homelessness, both as a suspect and as a victim. Now, for perspective's sake, and as the Chief mentioned during his press conference, the overall percentage of Part 1 crime is 3% of the total over Part 1 crime of the city. So while it is increasing within the confines of looking at it from that homeless lens, as far as it being a significant part of the overall crime, there are still other issues that are at play that have nothing to do with homelessness. I have not, nor has my staff or the other bureau commands, have detected vigilantism or any other targeted anti-homeless crime that's being committed by people outside of the community. And a person experiencing homelessness as a victim, the trend is still persons who are experiencing homelessness are also the suspect. We have initiated at the DOC that for the same high-level crimes, as you're aware, that command staff get notified on, shootings, homicides, traffic collisions with deaths, that they're indicating now on those DOC notifications as to whether or not those are homeless, so that my office can get a head start about looking at those crimes and evaluating whether or not they are part of a larger trend or pattern. So we will, the only real correlation that we know of, as I indicated earlier, is the increase in population being correlated to the increase in the crime, both on the victim side and on the suspect side.
And briefly, as you noted earlier, there's the homeless count. The county is beginning their efforts this evening. What is the role of the department overall as the count proceeds? Just
as awareness that these teams are going to be out there. I'll be putting out a DOC notice later on today to be read in roll calls tonight, and continue on for the next 3 days that we'll be able to identify a volunteer out there, and then obviously to respond for any calls of service if that becomes necessary.
Thank you.
Thank you. One just broad question you referenced earlier, with regard to reported crimes, the difficulty in getting crimes reported with a population that has some lack of trust with the police department. And there was a discussion last week with regard to the survey that is going to be undertaken, and I believe Chief or someone that was here reminded me that I think the Loyola Marymount group that's going to undertake this survey indicated that they will be making some efforts to. There was a little discussion about the occasions in which they come across people who are homeless, and there was some early thinking in the organization that maybe they just move over those people, but they assured us last week that no, they're going to be making extra effort. So I wanted you to comment on that and briefly, and just understand, are you expecting to be working in alignment with the development and implementation of that survey, so that we can assure that the expertise that you're bringing to bear in this area is going to be fully captured in that effort?
I would expect that if it was going to expand into a homeless element, my office would be called upon, and we will provide any and all support that's necessary to make sure that we get the information that's going to be valuable to us. In my conversations with Commissioner Murphy-Goldsmith, she posed a very interesting question as to why it is that we pay so much attention to police outreach, and what does that mean? And while I know from my chair what I think it means, it would be very interesting to see what the population thinks it means, and whether or not it's having the effect that we need it to have, which is that building of relationships and trust within those communities.
Okay, so I want to make sure, and you understand also, I'm asking for your assurance also that you will be engaged in the survey effort
Yes,
on
sir.
the front end to make sure that that you have an opportunity to add your expertise to that. Secondly, with regard to, you mentioned when you were commenting on just some broad takeaways, the overall increase in Part 1 crimes. And can you give us a sense, is there any rhyme or reason as to where you tend to see those increases? Are they in areas where the homeless population is concentrated, or are they random on the streets, or what does that picture look like?
So I'll give you my experience as an area commanding officer, and then I'll talk about it in a more broad sense. So my last command before the chief picked me for this position was in North Hollywood. North Hollywood sees some interesting concentrations of homelessness in and around the area of North Hollywood Park, down in the south end of the division, where the freeways meet the wash area, and then up in the north end along the train tracks. And when it comes to the violent crime, that is certainly the trend. When it comes to
what is certainly the trend?
They're correlated to the locations of where you're going to have an increase of homelessness. There's a lot of stress out there on the street. There's a lot of angst. There's a lot of misunderstanding, and I don't know that there's a lot of communication. And so that can result in violence. So we are seeing that because of the increased concentration. As far as the property crimes, they tend to be, at least in North Hollywood Division, they tended to run corridors, but be more spread out from those concentrations than could be correlated with the violent crime. As the homeless coordinator, looking at these crime numbers on a weekly basis, they are spread out evenly. Almost every command has seen an increase in almost all Part 1 crime categories. I don't have it off the top of my head which, there are some commands that have seen a reduction in certain categories of Part 1 crime. But when you look at it at a bureau level, it is universal across the bureaus that there's an increase in the crime across the city, which leads to my conclusion that the common factor there is the increase in population.
Okay, and with regard to just saying with the Part 1 crimes, are those how are they typically reported? I mean, those that are reported, are these calls for service, or
typically, yes,
sir, by the victim, or
yes, well,
a witness?
Yes, sir. Typically they're calls for service. In the violent crime category, typically we're responding to the call for service in the area, and this is just where we're talking about a homeless person as the victim. There are crime reports throughout the city that are made because a HOPE team, a senior lead officer, someone who already has a relationship with that encampment, has come by for a weekly check and just to see how folks are doing, and then they turn around and say, hey, by the way, and then that turns around into a crime report. And generally those have to do with property crime. As the reports where the suspect is homeless, those generally come from calls for service.
And so, in regards to the, if you're a victim, in your experience, these are people who, by and large, have mobile devices, or how are they calling it, making the phone call?
By and large, the homeless population have mobile devices.
And some time ago, I think this was probably in connection with maybe last year's report or one of them, there was a brief discussion of a situation that had occurred somewhere else in the country. It wasn't a homeless person; it was a person who was in medical distress, called 911 and wasn't able to provide a location as to where they lived or where they were, and therefore they didn't get the service they needed. Is there any risk of that, happening throughout the system, or is that, in other words, if you are a victim, a homeless person, victim of a crime, are you required to provide all of the same detailed information in terms of where you are and so on that
I'd have to
house might?
Yeah, well, I'd have to actually interface with Communications Division to ask how they bend their questions. I know for a fact they don't ask whether or not somebody is homeless.
No. I'm more concerned about the situation where someone can't give a street location. If you're living in some part of the city, you may or may not know the address or the cross street, or just even you may know a general location. So I'm just wanting to make sure that that's not another kind of crack that one might slip into, is if they need help, but they're not. If the 911 protocols require that information, maybe they don't. But that's what I'm asking, is to make sure that we have a way of getting to people who aren't able to provide a physical location as to where they are.
From a standpoint of technology that I'm aware of, when radio calls come out that aren't associated to a specific address and they come out through the cell phone system, they can lock that, or they can detect which tower that cell phone signal has come from, and then give a radius around that tower as to where generally that call came from. So in using the information that was provided by the caller and using that geographic data, that would be how the police officers would go and attempt to find that victim. I'm going to have to interface with Communications Division to see if that is a trend and if that's been seen to happen, and how many calls of that nature occurred, to be certain. But again, as a captain, a previous area commanding officer, I did not detect that as a problem.
Okay, if you could look into it and then just come back at some future time with a comment on it, I'd appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
I'm looking on page 12 of the report. Also, there's a discussion of the HOPE program, and in the second paragraph, there's a report of the reduction in the service per contact percentage is decreased from 35 to 14%. Can you just put a little more context in that for me?
We're on page 12.
Page 12, in the second paragraph, or towards the bottom there, the last full paragraph, it indicates that there was a 35% decrease from 35% to 14%
Yeah,
in the
it's
service per contact.
those are the same numbers that President Decker referred to in her report. So the change in protocol and the conscious effort on the department to allow LASA to take step first into those contacts.
Got it. Okay. All right. I'm going to page 14 relative to Transit Services Division. And in the middle of that paragraph, there's also a discussion of the service per contact percentage decrease from 41 to 18%. And this attributes that to, in part, due to a 40% drop in the workforce caused by officers taking family leave and those unable to work due to injuries. And when I'm reading this, it's suggesting to me that that the level of service is dependent on people potentially calling in sick or not being available. That can't be the answer, but that's what I'm asking you is that really what this is saying, is that there's a reduction in service whenever you have a larger number of officers who are on leave for whatever reason?
Well, it certainly is going to play a factor in a unit that has 10 people in it. So if 4 people are off at any one time because of illness, sick, long-term illness, and 2 of the months covered in this report are July and August, where we see the highest percentage of officers that are on their department-permitted percentage of vacations, which is 13% of a particular unit. So that is going to come into play.
There's no bench of any kind? I mean, it's just the 10 officers, so that if for whatever reasons 3 or 4 or 5 of them were out of service for some reason, that's what it is?
Yes, sir.
And why is that?
I can speak to you as post-contract that now that each one of these positions has been provided a bonus by the contract, simply having a substitute for those positions would take away from the deployment of somewhere else, and the selection process has to be initiated because of that bonus. But the real piece comes down to how we deploy our officers. If we were to take in officers to fill those positions, they would have to come from somewhere. And so the deployment in some other area, be it patrol, investigations, or another unit, would have to be reduced by the same amount.
So, Commissioner, I'll weigh in this. This is a contract that we have with Metropolitan Transit Authority, and for each position, we run approximately 240 shifts a day. These added resources for the HOPE, the engagement for transit, is an augmented. It's only been recently implemented this last year and a half. And this experience of seeing a reduction in service due to these absences, I look to Deputy Chief Chow and his in relationship with MTA as to where they make adjustments. The contract that we have with MTA is that it's a zero sum, meaning that we're not going to take resources from other parts of the department to augment the personnel that are assigned to transit. Transit does have, as every part of this organization, has instances in which people are going to be injured or have family leave or have absence from work. What I look to the deputy chief there is in balancing this. These resources that are there are also have additional training and expectations. And at this point, I'm satisfied that in this quarter, we saw this reduction. I'll be looking for the next quarter to get the restoration. I don't see this as a long-standing experience. The experience that we see with homelessness on transit systems, it is one of the more pressing issues for MTA. And in fact, that's where you saw in the red line, in that enforcement effort where the MTA's solution was to work and ask the department to have added deployments and take fare evasions as an enforcement effort. We countered and said, no, we're there for outreach and engagement. We'll support the safety of security officers on fare evasions. So that's that balancing act that we see quarter to quarter. So I would not expect this to continue, but at the same time, there is, as the commander indicated, there's no free lunch in the sense of if I'm dropping 2 or 3 personnel here, this would require us to take existing deployments on other bus or rail lines and redeploy them for this purpose. And what we're doing instead is we're holding those primary deployments as the first priority, and then this being a secondary priority.
Okay, it's a helpful explanation. I appreciate that. I would just note one thing I think it kind of leaves at least me unsettled about it is that it's it is really when we see it in the report, the data, they're kind of I don't know if lagging indicator is the correct term, but the point is that if there is some consideration, we wouldn't know about it until long after the fact. Right. In order to know whether there really is some value in trying to reconsider the policy, the approach.
I agree 1,000%. I'm not satisfied with the timing of this report either. And Chief Arcos is working with Commander Graham and the team to ensure that they have these more timely done. We should be within the quarter of the previous quarter.
Well, and what I'm saying here is, especially with regard to this particular issue, it would be helpful if there were a way to understand where the trend line is going and address it in something closer to real time. As I think that's the question, is whether you're able to, with the 10 people that you have, I don't know if there's, it is what it is if somebody's on leave or something, but that's just really the question of whether there's an opportunity to address this type of issue in real time, or whether you see the data also long after the fact, and we just observe what the situation was.
Well, we'll take a look at that, and then we'll report back to that, sir.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Do any other commissioners have questions?
Just one. Impact of fentanyl, new drugs on homelessness, availability, use on the crime against or crime within?
I'm sorry, sir, I don't have that readily available specific to fentanyl. I knew that there's been significant increases in narcotic enforcement, but I don't know the breakdown as to fentanyl. I'll be ready to talk about that, or I can transmit something to Mr. Tiefenk in regards to that.
Okay.
And Commissioners, forgive me, I wasn't here during the first part of Commander Graham's presentation, so I don't know if he covered this or not. He referenced it just in passing. You see a 50% increase in narcotic arrests. Yeah. These are felony arrests. These are not for possession or under the influence. These are for sales and transportation. One of the strategies that Chief Arcos has started within Central Bureau about 8 months ago and is continuing now in other parts of the city is that some of these encampments, certainly the more established or rooted encampments, locations, have in some communities we've heard become open-air drug markets, that people are preying on those people experiencing homelessness and their narcotic habits or dependency, and doing so as a matter of greed. And so I've asked, and the operations is responding to increasing the focus of narcotic enforcement details on the sales and transportation of narcotics involving people experiencing homelessness. It is, I believe, a serious matter for public safety, community safety, as well as the safety of the homeless community. And I believe also that its impact will help us lower the instances of violent crime being experienced within the communities of people experiencing homelessness. So you will see, you'll also see, as we develop, try to determine the sources of this, there may be a slight increase in the misdemeanor levels as a means of identifying where the sourcing of this narcotic trade is at. But as we go into 2020, Part 1 crime enforcement, solving those crimes, identifying people responsible for preying upon people experiencing homelessness. 2/3 of the crimes experienced by homelessness are violent crimes. So these are significant ag assaults, robberies, sexual assaults, homicides. So identifying who the underlying personnel, people responsible for that and bringing them to the justice system is critical to the safety of the community of people experiencing homelessness. But then also goes this issue of the prevalence of narcotics and the prevalence of the sales of narcotics. So those will be areas of focus that operations will be continuing to work on.
Good, thank you, Chief.
Commissioner Severov, do you have any other questions?
No.
And by the way, did the chief answer the question you had?
Yes.
No further follow-up is necessary from your team then.
Thank you,
Okay,
ma'am.
Thank you. Do we have public comment cards on this item?
Yes, ma'am, we have 6 cards. We have Adam Smith, Gina Viola, Hamid Khan, Jamie Garcia, Jonathan Foster, and the Red Chief Hunt.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, it's extremely disgusting that the commander is talking about taking part in the homeless count. Like, that's a good thing. LAPD should in no way be a part of the homeless count. While you all continue to approve more and more funding and budget line items to guarantee the LAPD or first responders to houselessness, we continue to see what those outcomes are. Brendan Glenn, Charlie Africa, Albert Ramon Dorsey, Victor Valencia. Speaking of Albert Ramon Dorsey, thanks to the CPRAs filed by the Stop LAPD Spine Coalition, we see that Ramon was murdered directly in a zone where officers from Hollywood Division were tasked with aggressive transient suppression. That's the language of this police department. Not services-led and the DNA of our officers. If you, Commander, are out doing the homeless count and you see a person taking a piss on the sidewalk, because the LAPD's budget makes sure that actual services, toilets, hand washing stations, showers, don't exist for houseless folks, what are you going to do? When you're participating in the homeless count, what will these increased points of contact with houseless people mean for them? And what mapping and data collection, whether formally or informally, will be being done by the LAPD officers so innocently taking part in the point-in-time homeless account? Dale Bonner, I think you should instruct the police department to none of these officers should take part in the homeless count. Our most vulnerable populations in this city desperately need less points of contact with the LAPD, not more. I don't give a fuck if they're pretending that it's this volunteer, feel good about myself, tap myself on the shoulder. I've done the homeless count. They don't want you out there.
Morning. It's important that you acknowledge the higher instance of mental illness out in the houseless community. You cited houseless individuals show PTSD within 7 days. LAPD has no business responding to mental health calls. We've established this over and over and over again. Mentally ill people end up dead when the LAPD is involved. And you admitted that within 7 days, most houseless individuals experience mental illness. So at this point, you need to be removing yourself from the situation. And I have to agree with Adam on the counts. In addition, I'd like to add that you have aggressively been doing sweeps as a means to manipulate these numbers that are going to happen. So it doesn't surprise me that the LAPD is volunteering to participate in the count because they're sweeping ahead of the counts to make sure the numbers look a different way than they actually are. So you really need to dig into that more deeply because that's exactly what's been going on for the last 2 weeks in the city all over the place. Have any of you paid attention to that? Have any of you been made aware of that? Okay. The LAPD has no business in the houseless population, dealing with the community, doing anything with them. People keep ending up dead. You keep shooting unarmed houseless people. Victor Valencia, the most recent person. Have you released the names of the officer who shot him? You have? Okay. Thank you for that. The other thing I wanted to point out, at one point you said something about the normal population as opposed to the houseless population. I think you need to think about that because It shows me that you don't see houseless individuals as humans at all. Not at all.
Thank you. Hamid Khan and then Jamie Garcia.
It's about 15 years ago when the LAPD launched the Safer Cities Initiative. This whole conversation reminds me of a report that Professor Gary Blasey came out with. And his key message to the community was that we are a culture that polices our way out of a problem. And that's exactly what we are looking at, that how we police our way out of these problems. The commander is talking about providing services. The Stop LAPD Spying Coalition did a whole joint project. It's called Our Data Bodies. And Professor Virginia Eubanks was one of the principal investigators. And we started looking at the coordinated entry system. And it's not really that whether the system exists, it's whether there's enough resources to back that system or not. And I think that's where the problem lies. Your own city controller in 2016-17 came up with an audit that the monies allocated by the city for homeless services, 87% of that allocated money went to the LAPD, policing our way out of these problems. So I think we can continue to keep on run around in circles because we've seen what broken windows policing did. We've seen what Safer Cities Initiative did. We've seen what CompStat policing is doing. So unless, we have a much deeper understanding, this body is going to remain a rubber stamp body because they need to invest time to investigate, to have public hearings, to have people who've been on the front lines of fighting back and exposing and researching. And not just just in theory, but in practice. We talked about public records. We talk about various other programs. So unless, we really come together and have a much deeper understanding of what is going on, we're going to continue to police our way out of problem, and we're going to have this conversation again next month, and the following month, and the following month.
Thank you, sir. Jamie Garcia and then Mr. Foster.
So since the dismantling of Laser, I've kept coming to the commission and speaking about the comprehensive review of programs, right? It's not just that there's a HOPE team and they operate in a silo and they go out and they, try to do this outreach. It's the fact that it all comes together. And we have maps. We have close to 3,000 maps that are letting us know how LAPD is actually going out into the community, how they're geographically policing communities and what they're being instructed to do. So this spin of service orientation can keep being articulated, but that's not the case. Hollywood SPU mission map, right, that we received January 24th, June 2018, or January 24th, 2018 to January 26, 2018. It specifically says aggressive transient enforcement, right? It specifically states that. So it's not service-oriented approaches. It's aggressive transient suppression. That is what's going on. That's what officers are being told. That's the culture. Right? We have proof of that. And so that's why I keep coming back and I keep coming back and I say there needs to be a further investigation, right? We have this data-driven scandal. We need to look at what's happening in these programs, what the result of these programs are. Chronic offenders, right? The list we got, 20% of them are listed as 1942 Transient Way, right, as their address. So then we know that they're being falsified and being put into this database, but again, nothing is being done. And so we come back again, and I know there's this politeness thing that keeps, being asked of us, but what we're saying is that you don't know what's happening. Moore can be saying things, he can be saying things, but we're actually getting the information of what's being said. Predpol, we did the density mapping. It's quarantining Skid Row. This is what they're doing. We already know reset is there, but they're actually using Predpol to quarantine Skid Row. We know the rezoning is coming. We know how the enforcement's going to be happening with 5611. So please come to us. We have the information. We know what's really going on. Listen to us.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. Mr. Foster and then Red Chief Hunt.
The whirlwinds of revolt will continue aspirations of our nation.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Appreciate it. You know, there is free lunch, Chief. You're wrong. Jesus gave freely, gave free lunch. The Israeli banker, Wall Street New World Order obstruction of Jesus Christ in the United States of America is the reason for homelessness. It has many offshoots that are contributors, like the criminal record, wage disparity, and extreme underpaying of immigrants or illegal aliens, personal facilities, as told by Mr. Smith. Thank you. These are contributors. We're all seeing homelessness grow and grow because the meeting of the needs of the people on the sidewalk has been obstructed and eroded by lawsuit. Sued homeless lines out of existence, blowing into the United States of America. Jesus is irrelevant and can't do anything for you. And still the homeless crisis is growing. The ACLU with the Jew sued prayer out of public schools. The school shootings are going up. And no banker knows or even wants to spend to fix on homelessness. All it does is obstruct Jesus. Now serving the needs of the people is put on the state, whether it's city, state, or fed. Now is costing the LAPD enormous resources it should not have to expend on an issue it shouldn't be addressing. It should be addressed by the church and possibly the family, but what if they don't have family and the family's broke? Then the church is supposed to step up, but the church is being obstructed by haters of Jesus. In the United States of America, the GDP is so huge, no one has to work. And we all in this room know this. Or if you don't, you're stupid. But everybody knows this in this room. There's GDP. We could be giving everybody $50,000, $60,000 a year and be zero homeless. Let's wake up, folks. That's why I'm in charge.
Sir, good morning.
Hey, good morning, Red Chief Hunt here. Welcome to 2020. I hope we're ready to listen, and I think that's where we messed up last year, is we didn't listen. Every commissioner up here should be listening. My last arrest was on the train. I think it was like in September, and it was for fare evasion. And what really puzzled me was that the city of Los Angeles spent almost $50,000 to arrest me for fare evasion when the train was broke and there was no such thing as a fare evasion because it wasn't coming out of the thing. So that's $50,000 to arrest me, take me to the hospital, come let me back out of jail and things like that. And after the reports for biased policing and things like that, you figure another $30,000 or $40,000 to investigate those 3 or 4 officers that was in charge of that detail at the time. You know, I listen to everybody here, and my job is to listen. And we've been making a lot of mistakes. You know, we pay. The controller came back and says most of our homeless fees are in consultant fees instead of actually housing them. You know, and this is what really makes no sense. The amount of money and time that we spend discussing this, and nothing never gets done. I can tell you it's 62,500 people that's homeless this year, and the count went up from 59,000 to 62,500. Good thing is that most of our volunteers are volunteers. You know, LAPD. You know, we have to make a change in this. You know, like I said, everybody's getting killed that's homeless. People that can't afford to really process you guys and take you guys to court and stuff like that. But I hope 2020, not for my sake, but for you guys' sake, bring a lot of good things, and you guys be aware of what people are saying. It's all right to listen.
Thank you, sir. The recommended action is to approve the department's report. Is there a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Second, I'll second it.
Before we vote, actually, could
Yes.
I ask a few more questions?
Oh, yes, sorry. Go ahead.
Aggressive transient enforcement, Chief, does sound like the opposite of enforcement as a last resort and services-led approach, which, of course, is concerning. Can you address that?
So I haven't seen the bulletin, and yet at the same time, and I understand the characterization. I will say that individuals experiencing homelessness that are preying upon either other members within that homeless community or that are committing crimes of violence or property crimes in the neighborhood are going to have the attention of the Los Angeles Police Department. Our obligation in balancing community safety is to recognize that experiencing homelessness, while a life challenge, does not provide one the ability to not adhere to the social conduct of following the law. I do not see, and nor do I believe, our stats anywhere represent aggressive enforcement with blocking of a sidewalk, for instance. And one only need move around the city and see that the department is not aggressively enforcing the blocking of a sidewalk. We do, with 4118A and D of the Los Angeles Municipal Code, enforce when voluntary compliance cannot be achieved, access in or out of a building. It's called ingress or egress into building entrances, as well as the American Disability Act requirement that there be the ability to pass on a sidewalk. Yet, even with that enforcement, and even with that posture, you still see countless blocks around the city in which ADA requirements are not being met. That is the department's efforts to ensure a balance. We very much represent Mr. Smith and others that the LAPD should not be the initial resource for people experiencing mental illness, substance abuse, or this challenge of their very existence. However, the police and fire remain the resources that answer the phone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in an attempt to balance this humanitarian crisis of our generation. We're trying to do so with compassion, and at the same time, we also recognize that there are instances in which people do not believe they should be required to follow the law, and that they have the right or the authority, because of their placement or station in life, to prey upon others. So when we see this, I don't have the full context of that statement, but we will look at it to ensure that the context of how we go out enforcing laws involving people experiencing homelessness demonstrates services first, but at the same time, there is a consequence.
Please
Thank
stop
you.
shouting out during the chief's response.
I appreciate that, Chief, and certainly there's a lot to balance here, and I agree that the statistics in terms of citations for people blocking the sidewalk has gone way down, and that is an indication that that type of enforcement is in fact decreasing. We've talked a lot about culture change and the many ways that officers interact with people experiencing homelessness that may or may not result in a citation or an arrest, but there may be a certain level of mixed messages that officers receive, and they're just not sure how they're supposed to relate to people experiencing homelessness given the kind of competing interests and pressures. And I think the department has been clear in all the ways that, the public that I can observe in terms of communicating a message of enforcement as a last resort. But I wonder whether language like aggressive transient enforcement may send mixed messages, and it may appear to some officers that what's being asked of them is to enforce against people experiencing homelessness, as opposed to what I think you're saying, which nobody would disagree with, which is violent crime, crime where there's a victim, or even some of the, blocking the sidewalk if it's an ADA issue. But those are specific types of crimes with specific types of impacts, whereas aggressive transient enforcement just sounds like it sounds very scary. It sounds very much like it's targeted at people who don't have homes for not having homes. And so I appreciate the request, Chief, to see the full context of the bulletin, and I wonder whether there's some way that we can discuss that in the commission, just to have a greater understanding of what's being asked of officers and how that full context is being provided to avoid unnecessary or harmful interactions and enforcement.
Absolutely. So I'll ask to work with operations and North Hollywood specifically to understand. I think the speaker gave a specific date range in January of last year or the year before, 18 or 19?
If we could not have cross dialogue, I asked Ms. Garcia if you could please submit it to Mr. Tifank. Thank you very much. There was another question for Mr. Bonner.
Thank you. Staying on the same topic of the aggressive transit enforcement, first question is, because I'm not familiar with the term either, but the first question If there is a bulletin or some determination that that's the posture, whether it's on any given day or hour or period, is it something that would emanate from your work or is it Chief Arcos and operations that would be? And what is the overlay between, on the one hand, you're working on the, in theory on the services side, and then you have the enforcement side as well. So help me understand how the two of you coordinate, if at all.
Yeah, good morning, Commissioners. Bob Arcos from the Office of Operations. That type of strategy or posture would begin at the area level. Area level starts with daily crime. The commanding officer reviews daily crime every day, and they develop missions and strategies based on the crime trends that they're seeing. So again, without seeing the bulletin or the characterization of aggressive transient behavior, I think the chief did a very good job of explaining that there are aggressive actions and conduct by people experiencing homelessness, preying on one another, or citizens walking through our communities. So that may be something that was designed from that as well. We've also had issues over time where we have aggressive panhandling, and the officers may write that down as a mission to look at those people who are running out in the middle of the street, trying to begging for money or trying to clean cars, etc. So again, if the chief is asking me to take a look at it, we'll look at it from all 21 areas to see if that's even a mission that was developed. Again, the characterization is insensitive to those people that are experiencing homelessness, but we'll take a look at it. But
is it a term that is part of your playbook, so to speak?
No, not. So there's terminology that define what the mission is. So again, I have not seen that as one that I've utilized before myself as an area command officer, or as a commander, as a bureau chief, or even the director of office operations. But again, missions and strategies are developed at the area level based on the behavior and conduct that they're experiencing in these areas, and what is the business or the residential community asking for, or what do they complain about. So those things start becoming strategized and developed. So there may be aggressive behavior, not for the aggressive work of the officers to go out there and seek that type of activity, but to addressing the behavior, the conduct that's occurring on the streets. So they want to help mitigate that by either a visible presence or enforcement action.
So that is something that the two things I'd just say is, one is it'd be helpful to have some clarification of that as to how that, if there is an aggressive transient bulletin or what have you. I'd also want to understand, does it emanate from calls for service where someone is reporting a problem that you're responding to?
Yes,
or is it something that in a ComStat or morning briefing or roll call, someone is more proactively determining that's what's going to be done? So I'd appreciate some information on that. And then just more broadly, I would like you to think a little bit about this. One of the things that I'm concerned about just this discussion kind of, or a risk that this discussion is kind of exposed, in my opinion, is the risk that you're doing your work, on the warm, fuzzy side, trying to help on the services, and then there may be a different posture that maybe they're both appropriate, but not strategically well thought out together. I don't know, but that's what I need to understand a little bit better, to make sure that we're not going 2 steps forward, 1 step back, where you're out trying to do one thing, and then your officers under your command are taking a different strategy. So I'd appreciate some appropriate, whatever the chair may think is appropriate, some further briefing really on that issue as to how does the department as an organization, institution, make sure that your two efforts are completely aligned.
If I could perhaps synthesize this conversation, if any commissioner has any follow-up, we're asking for a report back from the department on the following. The term aggressive transient policing. I'd ask Ms. Garcia to please give, if you're available, to provide Mr. Tiefenk with a copy of the document or documents related to that term. But beyond what Ms. Garcia has, I'd like the department to report back more generally and do a wider search on the use of that term and how it's used and whether it's used in a widespread manner, so that we have a better context for it, whether it's just in the materials that were disclosed or whether it's used more broadly. And then to follow up on Commissioner Goldsmith's comments, the commission would like a report back on how we can be assured that the reporting that's provided to us here is being permeated or sent down to the rank and file, and that it does become the culture of the department. And large part of that has to do with the language that is used and the training that is given. But I think we need greater assurance, because that term has a lot of meetings that I think very rightfully so has raised some concerns. If I didn't capture what you were intending correctly, I welcome edits.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Good job. I do just want to mention, I heard, the phrase aggressive panhandling, and just in the context of this conversation, it concerns me deeply that we would be implying that people who are experiencing homelessness, that we are policing their aggressive behavior. I think it's absolutely appropriate, obviously, to enforce crime. But if people don't like the fact that certain people are aggressive, that is not a crime. And I can see how that sort of thing gets convoluted in these contexts. And I just want to be careful that just because someone's being aggressive and making people uncomfortable, because they're extremely poor and desperate and face possible death, that we're not using the police force to prevent that sort of discomfort and that sort of behavior when it's not otherwise criminal.
Commissioner, what you just characterized, though, is that what you just described will generate a radio call. That will generate a radio call. If you're that person who is experiencing that aggressive behavior, whether it's risen to the level of a crime or not, it's going to generate a radio call. And these are what our officers are dealing with every single day. Right. Certainly none of us like the verbiage that was used on the mission sheet. It would have probably been more appropriate if they had a specificity of a person or described person that's creating that behavior, so the mission is much more direct for the officers. So that's what we're going to look at from the Office of Operations.
I appreciate that, and I think the calls for service thing is a real issue, obviously, and we in the department can't control the racism and the biases and the classism and the fear that drives calls for service, and nor am I interested in judging any of that. What I'm more concerned about that we do have control over here is how the police respond. And so I wonder how you would direct your officers to respond when somebody's calling, they're afraid. Let's not judge that. For whatever reason, this is scary for them. They want help. They're calling you for help. You understand this. No crime has been committed. You understand the liabilities of law enforcement getting involved with people experiencing homelessness, especially mentally ill people who are not committing a crime. And so how do you balance that, and what should an officer do who I'm sure cares deeply about the call for service and should, I hope, care at least equally about the person experiencing homelessness and mental illness? So what do you tell your officers to do in those situations?
Well, our officers are always on the radio call, have to investigate. They have to investigate why they're there and what happened, what's causing the radio call, and to begin a problem-solving process, whether or not it's just going to be some sort of advice, both to the person who's reporting or to the person who is causing the radio call. And then the officers have a number of tools that have been designed by this department through the number of trainings that we send them through MHIT, through all the services services that are now being provided. Maybe call an HOPE officer, maybe call the UHRC if that person needs that. But there is, again, it is a blend. It is a blend of the work from leading with compassion and empathy and services, and also drawing a line, though, did the conduct rise to the level of a criminal act, where they would have to take some sort of enforcement measure from that point.
And Commissioners, if I could ask, perhaps on the report we could come back. Aggressive panhandling is a legal definition. It is not just a term or phrase, and so there are specific elements, and the officers have been given direction relative to what constitutes a violation. And of course, it is a low-level crime, so it's a matter that there is discretion on the part of the officer seeking compliance, gaining cooperation. But I think the conversation would be better served by actually coming back because there is a sensitivity, and our officers are looking for direction from us, and that is that, to your point of referencing that a person is hungry, the person is desperate, the person is aggressive, they have that right, if you will, and what, law enforcement taking action against that. That is not the circumstance of the Los Angeles Police Department. We want to get that individual help and assistance and support. Certainly we want people starving and dying on the street, yet they do. And yet, in this instance also, though, the balance is an individual who feels that they're being extorted or their vehicles being damaged because of a person who's got a squeegee washer and deciding that they're not going to move out of the way. They're going to block that pathway. So there are limits to the conduct, and there's times in which it's enforcement. We are not an agency that sees a great deal, that sees the numbers on aggressive panhandling, I think, are very low. We generally get compliance by working with individuals in the field. But I think that this, again, if we come back with what we're actually talking about here in a written report, I think we'd be better off.
Having further definitions of all these terms and,
Yes.
and how officers are trained on these terms,
Yes,
or how they're interpreting these terms would be very helpful. What's a reasonable report back time period, Chief?
I wanted to make sure I added also to the list. Also,
Yes,
I was
sir.
asking for a comment on the level of coordination, either as it exists or whether it should exist between Commander Graham and his operations and
Correct.
yours.
Correct. And Chief, timeline?
I would ask for report for 60 days. Actually, 45 days, I think we can do this. You know, just for clarity, Commissioner Bonner, Commander Graham works for Assistant Chief Arcos as a function of the Office of Operations, so that the consistency of our homeless efforts and strategies is coordinated across the 4 geographic bureaus in 21 areas. This is an area that we see as not having mixed messages and giving officers and command officers the best opportunity to understand what our desire is. But we'll be happy to define that relationship as well and put that in the report.
Okay,
in
for
45 days to the Commissioner, does that meet your
45 days.
satisfaction?
45 days, and we have a motion pending to approve the report that's been moved and seconded.
Thank you. And just before this item closes finally, since we talked about calls for service, I did ask many moons ago, maybe a year and a half ago or so, for a report from the department looking into ways to divert calls for service away from law enforcement to a mental health provider, a more appropriate response when a resident is calling for something that really is not a crime or something that requires a law enforcement to get involved. And I know there's some other places, Portland, Oakland, a couple places around the country that are using creative community-based systems for responding to mental health calls so that law enforcement doesn't get involved and doesn't risk escalating the situation. And I know the department's done some work on a suicide prevention element of that, but I would like to ask for, and I understand the department's doing work, but I need the report back here publicly, even if it's not perfect and it's not done. If it could just come back, and if I could see what are the other models for this, what are the relevant statistics? You know, what do you know now about these calls for service, and what additional systems would need to be in place so that the people picking up the phone can differentiate different types of calls for service, and what might be some of the options for diverting those calls to more appropriate response systems. And I understand that all requires resources and collaboration, most likely with the county, but we need to start kind of understanding the problem and what possibilities there are in order to advocate for additional resources and solutions. So maybe that could come back in 30 days.
Yes,
Well,
that's
can it all come back at the same time, please, Chief? I'd
Ab-
appreciate one
Thank you.
point, and I'd ask Commissioner Goldsmith, since you have worked on these issues for so long, if you would help coordinate with Mr. Tiefenk and the department in getting this report back to
Thank
us
you,
in a
yes.
timely way, and be sure it's as thorough and covers all of these items. I
Appreciate that, yes.
Commissioner.
I'm done.
Anything else? So the motion's been moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? It then passes 4-0. Thank you all very much for all of the public comments, as well as commissioner comments, and to the department as well. Thank you all very much. Item B on the agenda is the report relative to the inspection of the suspected child abuse reports for the period of January 1st to June 30th, 2019. I note, Chief, or I believe, that last week the Chief gave us a very thorough overview of what we would expect in this report. And I viewed it as largely consistent, and although the report provides more detail in terms of all of the numbers, because this is important, even though we heard a preview last week, I would like to hear an overview from the department before we open to questions and comments. So, Chief.
Good morning, Commissioners. Chief, I'm Deputy Chief Chris Pitcher. I'm the Chief of Detectives. Here with me today is the brand new Juvenile Division Captain, Captain Chris Waters, and the department's SCAR subject matter expert, Lieutenant Carrie Potter. So several months ago, to give you an overview, a reporter published a story relative to 4,000 SCARs or suspected child abuse reports that went uninvestigated between the dates of January 1st of 2018, conclusive of June 30th of 2019. And basically, the reporter made the statement that these were completely uninvestigated by the LAPD. They got their statistics from the DA, and basically it focused around all of the SCARs that were closed as quote-unquote no investigation. That is the proper closure for an investigation of that type, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And that is what is used by the county SCAR system to close an investigation. So any investigation that's closed as no investigation is, by this department, it is a non-criminal matter that we find that there is emotional abuse or general neglect only. And so for the most part, what we're looking at in terms of these 4,000 SCARs, which turns out in reality to be 3,987 SCARs, because of this story and this claim, the chief had directed Detective Bureau and Juvenile Division to open up a comprehensive inspection of each one of those 3,987 SCARs to ensure that they were appropriately reviewed, received, handled, and closed out. And so that was done over a 2.5-month period. We looked at all of those, and so what we're looking at is this no investigation classification is misleading. It's a misnomer. The reality is there is an existing memorandum of agreement between this department, between the LA County DA's office, the County Department of Children and Family Services, and the LA County Sheriffs, as well as several other agencies, law enforcement agencies that participate in the SCAR system. And this no investigation by agreement, and all of the law enforcement agencies have this, is anytime we find that when we receive a SCAR investigation that it fits this, there is no criminal allegation at all. It's just a emotional abuse, or once again, the general neglect. That then is transferred over to the Department of Children and Family Services for investigation. So of this 3,987 SCARs that were claimed as no investigation, an in-depth review of all of these has shown, and I will turn it over once again to the SCAR expert, but ultimately about 1,600 of those were non-criminal in nature and ultimately transferred over to the Department of Children and Family Services, where they were in fact investigated. An additional 1,600 plus of these SCARs were also what we call duplicates, whereas anytime a SCAR is reported, there can be multiple reports of this same incident. So 1,600 plus, and I will give it over to Lieutenant Potter here to discuss the specifics, but those were reported as duplicates and ultimately closed out as no investigation required by this department. But once again, there was a review, a thorough review conducted by the Department of Children and Family Services. There are some additional issues with that we end up that there were criminal investigations that were conducted but inappropriately closed out as no investigation, which meant there was a thorough investigation completed on, I believe, 300 plus of these incidents, but they were inappropriately closed out as no investigation. That has been remedied we have provided department-wide training to all juvenile coordinators as to appropriately how to close out an investigation. And additionally, backing up, this department has also made an official recommendation to the county SCAR system to basically get rid of that no investigation classification. It's kind of a misnomer and it's misleading to the public. We want to make sure that they don't get the impression that these are not being investigated when in fact, when they are not investigated by a law enforcement agency, they are in fact followed up and thoroughly investigated by the Department of Children and Family Services for a non-criminal matter. So looking at it, this investigation did find 10 incidents where we felt, as the juvenile experts within juvenile division, felt that these required additional follow-up, investigation, and ultimately procedural fixes to make sure that these investigations were thorough, closed out, and appropriately handled, and they have been. So all of the 10 out of the 3,987 scars that we found that needed additional, they were closed out and fixed by January 1st of this year. I'm going to turn it over to Detective Potter if you have any further specific investigations on this incident, as well as moving forward and the process fixes that we've recommended.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Did you have anything you wanted to add before we jump into questions?
Go right ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Chief, and of course, the Chief of LAPD for last week's preview of this. I've gone over this report, as I know my colleagues have, and have done the breakdown of the numbers. And fundamentally, I come down to, I think, two questions, really. And I can understand why there would be reporting on this issue, because clearly 4,000, seeing that number was deeply concerning. And I recall we questioned the chief on that when the reporting first came up. And I appreciate that an investigation took place internally to determine where those numbers came from. And this categorization of no investigation certainly is, it does not adequately describe the breakdown that was provided. Is that, changing that terminology, that category, is that something that everyone in the system has to jointly agree to, or can the department independently start subcategorizing, perhaps, to give clarity so that this issue doesn't come up again, even if there is some disagreement amongst departments as to what to do? So I'm not sure, Lieutenant, if that's a question for you or for one of the chiefs here.
So the eSCAR database is controlled by the county, and ultimately that decision of how the case categories that they can be dispositioned is up to the district attorney's office. So we can make a recommendation, but as part of our training and what we're discussing moving forward is when we do disposition something with no investigation, to be much more thorough in the comments of the disposition as to why it was given that disposition, such as a case that was general neglect, that it was no law enforcement investigation, DCFS investigation.
Understood. So right now, the only alternative the department has, since this system's controlled by the county, is to ensure that there's a deeper explanation under the why, so that should this issue come up again, you have access to that information.
Yes, and certainly we are working with the county, the Office of Child Protection, and DCFS, the District Attorney's Office, to make improvements overall in how we address these cases, and specifically other options in the disposition for eSCARs.
The second area of questioning I have relates to the 10. And no matter how small that number is when it comes to children, obviously that's a very large number, because every child is dependent on adults to do the right thing and ensure that there's appropriate follow-up and appropriate investigation. And while on one hand one can say it was only 10, to me that's a very large number again, because we're talking about children. And I'm not sure that I'm satisfied with the resolution of having, or the recommendation of having, random audits to ensure that no children are lost in the system. I'm not sure that that's sufficient to ensure that we don't lose children in this system. It seems to me we have to go above and beyond when it comes to children. I'm wondering if the department has considered other alternatives. Are there other ways to ensure that we don't lose children in this paperwork system that is, by its nature, run by other departments? And how do we ensure that we're doing everything we can for the children that are under our responsibility?
So certainly the system that we have in place that we feel is very comprehensive. Every SCAR investigation that comes to our department is reviewed by a subject matter expert within juvenile division. Our investigative control unit during weekdays and business hours reviews each and every one of those SCARs to determine if it requires an immediate dispatch of an officer, or if the circumstances described in the SCAR necessitate or can be a delayed response that gets dispatched to the area of responsibility. And improvement that we've recently identified that the chief has mandated that these cases be completed within 10 days, where in the past they've been completed within a 30-day window.
So based on the changes that have been made, are you confident that the 10 would not have been lost in the system? The 10 that should have been investigated originally, do you think that all of these improvements ensures that that won't happen again?
I think definitely the 10-day window is an improvement. Those will, be reviewed certainly by ComStat to ensure that those dates are being met, and incumbent on each of the areas, and the continued training that we'll be conducting to ensure that no child is missed in the system.
Chief, I sense you wanted to say something. Sorry.
Yeah, with the system that we have in place, I believe that we are confident that they are being held, or they are handled appropriately. Coming through, we find out that whether it is a critical nature, they are basically dispatched immediately, or it's sent out to the division for a timely follow-up. And so it is with cutting it down from 30 to 10 days investigation, and ultimately the follow-up that we see in the 10 days and the actions that are taken are what we look at. Consequently, at ComStat, I look at those and we review all of those for timeliness, each one of those SCAR investigations with the divisions that come through there for that inspection to make sure that they are investigated. And 10 days is a very quick turnaround. The chief's goal for that, I believe is very, very appropriate in terms of making sure that the actions are taken and not pushed out a month. So the 10-day window that we see is very quick, and ultimately, like I said, when we see that at the divisional level and then at ComStat during an inspection, I believe that that's going to focus and make sure that your concerns are met on the front end as well as the back end.
When might we expect the first audit to be completed to evaluate this newer system that will be that is being implemented, the 10 days, and the recommendation was to have the audit division conduct a yearly. Does that mean we have to wait a year to see how the new system is working?
I'll check, ma'am, with the audit division to find out when they've scheduled that audit, but we can push that.
I'd appreciate that.
Yes, ma'am.
I think we need to be assured that the system is actually working and not find out a year from now that there were deficiencies or other recommendations they could identify.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And Commissioner, on the 15-2, we indicate that the audit plan for this current fiscal year, meaning 1920. So I would expect this to be audited by audit division by June of this year. We do want to provide the first quarter to have some time in which to experience the changes, if you will, but I would look to audit division at the end of the first quarter to grab a sampling of these cases and conduct an inspection audit to bring back before this group.
Thank you, Chief.
Before this board.
Thank you. I'll leave to my other colleagues to ask questions, and I'll see if I have any follow-up, but thank you. Sir.
Thank you. Couple, just looking on the first page of the report. First, can you help me understand the connection? This is in the third and fourth paragraphs. So the third paragraph is referencing the 3,987 cases that you referred to, and mentioned that 10 were problematic and looked at. What is the relationship between that 10 and then the next paragraph that identified 302 that were identified as, that looks like they were identified as problematic?
So, sir, of the SCARs you're looking at in that paragraph, the 304 cases, that refers to the fact that those were cases where they had already conducted the investigation and either did an injury report or a crime report and misclassified it, closed it as no investigation, when in fact they had already done a full, complete, and thorough investigation. The 10 are the ones that we looked at and ultimately required additional information, investigation, and appropriate handling on.
And so going to the 10, that's what also wasn't clear, where it says that the 10 cases found to be problematic were investigated and properly documented. Were they just documentation issues?
There were the gamut, the documentation issues ultimately not going as far as we would like them to rise to those standards, the closeout, the way that they close those out, and ultimately, how they deferred those. There were a couple of those instances that did not occur in the city of Los Angeles and ultimately had to be handled by, outside the Los Angeles County Sheriffs. The way that those were handled and ultimately transferred gave us concern, so we made sure that we took appropriate action in those cases too.
And the determinations that are referenced here, are these qualitative reviews that involve some discretion or judgment as to the closing of the investigation, or are they more checking the box, something's closed because it didn't fit this criteria or that criteria? What is the nature of what's behind the determination to close an investigation?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, how we handle it, the investigation in total, or how it's
No,
closed?
what I'm asking is, generally speaking, I could envision in some cases someone is looking really to check the box to say this was an alleged allegation of this or that, and it doesn't meet that, so we're closing it. The other is someone's investigating something and making a discretionary judgment as to whether it rises to the level of a crime or something of that nature. So I'm asking, what is is it really these investigations resulting in discretionary determinations that are based on the specific facts of the case, or are they more definitional? Something, here are the circumstances reported on paper, they don't fit this criteria definition, and so that's what I'm.
No, sir. The initial review or triage done by the investigative control unit would be that paper review. Does it rise to the level of something that needs to be immediately dispatched to a patrol unit to investigate, or is it something that, based on the circumstances, could be delayed and sent to the area? Every single case that we handle, every single child abuse case that we handle is investigated, where our requirement is that an officer make contact with the person reporting or the possible victim in this case to get the facts as they're known or reported to ensure that a crime has not been committed. And in each of these 10 cases, it was determined that none of these rose to the level of a crime, and our procedure then for documenting the facts of the investigation is to document that on an injury report. The thoroughness of the investigation, there's nothing that's just done by paper. It is always done through investigative interviews.
And am I understanding correctly what you're describing is relates to the out-of-home cases?
It could be out of home and it could be in home. I think the out of home cases are the ones that DCFS refers to law enforcement that they don't respond to. But there are situations in home where there's a joint investigation done by the police department and DCFS.
So I'm looking now at the conclusion page 8. Where this is the no investigation disposition is misleading because all cases of in-home suspected child abuse are investigated by DCFS. Cases that occur outside the home are not investigated by DCSF or DCFS and are evaluated out to law enforcement for investigation. So when I'm reading that, at least quickly, it's telling me that for those that are in-home, DCFS handles them, and that you're handling those that are out of home. That's not the correct understanding.
The types of cases that don't rise to the level of a crime, which could be general neglect, emotional abuse, those cases that law enforcement's not involved in are only that occur in home are only investigated by DCFS. But there are situations, whether it's physical abuse or alleged sexual abuse that occurs within the home, there's concurrent investigations done by law enforcement and DCFS.
So is this statement maybe a little overstated or incorrect? Or I'm reading again where it says, that no investigation disposition is misleading because all cases of in-home suspect child abuse are investigated by DCSF. Now, it may be that they're investigating all, and you are also investigating
Correct.
some of those, is what you're saying. Okay,
Correct.
so that's
Right,
that's the
right.
helpful
Yes.
clarification. And then in that case, where does the buck ultimately stop? In terms of, is there some risk that let's take a case where maybe you both look at it, and you may come to different conclusions, or a case where, even an out-of-home case where you look at it and decide there's no investigation. Does the buck stop then with you I don't mean you personally, but with the department in making that determination, or is there some opportunity for someone that may have a different view of the facts to make the case for a different disposition?
Certainly, we work in partnership with DCFS to ensure the safety of the child and their protection ultimately. But if it's something that's an alleged crime or could be a crime, the buck stops with us and law enforcement to determine if a crime has been committed based on our investigation. And then we would move forward if there's any charges to be filed to meet with the district attorney's office.
In that coordination that you're referencing, are there circumstances where you come out with different conclusions and that results in some discussion, or do you have a practice of deferring essentially to whomever's according to the agreement, whoever's responsible for making the determination?
Certainly based on what the allegations are, we have different roles as law enforcement and as DCFS, the social workers. We have different roles in the overall process. We're trying to determine if a crime was committed and address that specific issue. If a crime is committed, then to seek prosecution, whereas DCFS's role is ultimately the safety of the home, if there isn't a crime, if there's education that can be done within the house, within the parenting, to ensure safety, well-being, aside from criminal activity.
But so when we're getting at a little bit, and there was reference here, and even I think it was last week in the chief's report, we're concerned a little bit about the risk of each organization, grasping their part of it and considering their work done, and then maybe there's some situation where, because of the facts involved, it slips through a crack. So what I'm asking, for example, is have you ever seen a case where there's been a disagreement about the disposition, and you actually have to then talk amongst yourself with your other partners to figure out, really if everybody can agree with the same disposition? Or once you say no investigation, do they say, okay, LAPD made that call, so we've done our part, they've done their part, and we're just closing the file? Have you ever seen a case, I'm just practically speaking, you ever seen a case where
No.
anybody's had to pick up the phone and say, this one I think needs someone to take another look at it, or take another?
Not personally, but certainly if during DCFS's investigation in conducting interviews with family members and such, if they came upon additional information that they believed rose to the level of a criminal act, then they would contact us and we would do further investigation. But no, I haven't personally encountered that situation. But realizing as an organization that there's always room for improvement, we are working with the county, including DCFS, the district attorney's office, to make sure that we have the best communication and cooperation for the benefit of these children.
Thank you.
Commissioner, if I can, I know I'm the new kid on the block, but last week as well as this week, we are members of this collaborant. So we meet, I sit on the eSCAR steering committee. We have a working committee with the district attorney's office, DCFS, our department, the sheriff's department, where these things are discussed. Obviously, the newspaper article was discussed. And again, we're working in collaboration with our partners to do other things, as well as co-responding. We have a pilot program with DCFS as well as ourselves in Mission and Foothill, where we're moving to begin to co-respond, kind of like what we do with MEU with the SMART teams.
Co-respond meaning that, and those are, so you're not, the collaboration you're referring to is not simply on the broader high-level coordination of the arrangement and so on, but there are factual cases where, factual situations where there's some some collaboration going on within regard to a specific set of facts?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Are there other questions from commissioners? No. Seeing none, public comment, how many cards do we have?
Card, we have Jonathan Foster.
Mr. Foster.
I wouldn't think I'd be the only one. Emotional abuse or neglect could be covered under the law for intentional emotional trauma. A person could be sued under that claim. That does happen. And so all reports for these assertions right now are being unaddressed for not being a crime are in fact possible crimes. Yeah, people get sued for that. I would think that every claim should be duplicated and sent over to the Department of Child Services for review for emotional abuse or neglect. And thank you for 30 days to 10 days change. I would suspect it's a personnel issue or a budget issue. But if police functions cannot get addressed not related to SCARS, then the SCARS functions have to be being impacted by that same issue. So moving from 30 days to 10 days has to call on personnel to operate under more time pressure. If a big city emergency arises, 10-day window might not be met. Yeah, so, but it's great that you moved it. I mean, I'm a foster. I don't have any children, but I certainly wouldn't hit children. I was spanked as a child. I don't appreciate my parents much. The service that they perform for the United States Army is unmatched. But I don't appreciate them being a foster for being hit by my parents. So I would think that, things that might seem emotional or neglect, even the person making the call, the claim might not really actually know how to say what's really going on to the police department. So, but this is a very gray area, but thanks for making a change. You did great.
Madam President, we do have one late card.
I'll allow that since it's just one.
Okay. Randall Bernard Allen.
Mr. Allen.
I'm a single father. My son just turned 17. I was falsely arrested by LAPD, and my son was taken to foster care. That stuff that they're talking about is not how they handled my case. It took me 3 years to get my son out of foster care after I was acquitted on all charges after 13 months spent in the county jail. I'm still being harassed, monitored. My phone, I'm in arbitration with AT&T right now by these, I guess, LAPD officers or they agents. But that stuff that they're talking about is not how they handle my case, not how they handle my son's case. My son is dealing with trauma right now. We're still being, I came all the way from Tennessee. I was falsely arrested, acquitted after 13 months. Took me 2 more years after that to get my son out of foster care. And then I settled a civil lawsuit with the city of Los Angeles. And my attorney advised me to get out of California for possibly being retaliated against. And I moved to Tennessee. Been in Tennessee 2 years now. I've been nothing but harassed. And every electronic device that I have has been hacked into. Just came back here October of last year to get back in the court or to do something about this. Me and my son have been through enough, and I'm sick of it. I'm sick of it. Something needs to be done about what's going on within LAPD, within Los Angeles Sheriff Department, California law enforcement, period. My son shouldn't have to be subjected to the stuff that he's being subjected to, and neither should I. I'm being monitored for nothing, and I'm specifically looking at you because these are LAPD officers that did this. Louis Carranza and Thomas Small. If you Google my name, Randall Bernard Allen, it'll show you my case. Something needs to be done, though. I'm not going to sit around accepting it no more. That's why I came.
Thank you,
I
sir.
put all my stuff in storage and came out here. I need help with this.
Thank you, sir.
LAPD needs to do something or somebody needs to do something about what's going on, what me
Sir-
and my son are experiencing.
So,
Thank you for coming and sharing your story. I'm sorry, Chief, did I?
Madam President, if we could, I would like to have this man, if he would speak with my sergeant in the back. Sir, if you'll speak with the gentleman near the tie that's walking towards you, he'll take your information and I'll look into your concerns.
Thank you.
And President Decker, if I might just add briefly as well, as the Inspector General, we have staff here. If there's a complaint of misconduct of Albany LAPD, we'll have our staff meet with him as well.
Thank you. The recommendation is to approve the department's report. Is there a motion? Moved. A second? Second by Mr. Bonner. All in favor? Aye. It passes 4-0. Thank you all for your presentation. Item C is a grant application and award. Let me just ask the commissioners, do you have any questions on this item? Questions? Seeing no questions, do we have public comment on item C?
We have one. We have Jonathan Foster.
Mr. Foster?
As I wanted to say, for a grant, is this a monetary grant? Do we, it's money. Okay, great. You know, it's approved, I guess. It's funny how there's so much money in LA. There's so much, 26 billionaires, $87 billion. I hope the grant's big enough. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The recommended action is to approve the department's report and transmit to the mayor and city council. Is there a motion? Moved in second. I'll second it. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Passes 4-0. On to then the chief's report. Chief?
Good morning, Commissioners.
Morning, Chief.
As is customary, I will first provide a notification relative to an in-custody death that occurred on the 14th of January at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning at our 77th Street Regional Jail. It was the previous day at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning that a female white, later identified as Lalea Sabdafi, was arrested by Southeast Patrol officers on a private person's arrest for misdemeanor trespassing. She was transported to 77th Jail, and when she was processed or booked there, while she was there, she was also treated at the dispensary or the medical facility there and given some medication for her underlying medical condition. Medical staff approved her housing at that within the 77th Jail complex. The following day, on the 14th, she advised medical staff that she was not feeling well, and she was moved from her holding cell into the dispensary in a wheelchair, where she apparently began experiencing chest pains and went into cardiac arrest. Medical staff immediately provided CPR and was assisted by our detention officer staff that was there. In addition, Los Angeles Fire Department paramedics arrived and continued to administer CPR for approximately another 30 minutes with negative results. Unfortunately, she was pronounced dead at 7:10 in the morning. This resulted in the Force Investigation Division responding, and they'll conduct their investigation as to the facts and circumstances of her passing. Additionally, the Officer Inspector General was notified and responded, and we are awaiting any further information from the coroner's office as to the cause of her death. As for the significant activities this past week, I want to extend my thanks to Captain Captain Nyman out of the Valley Traffic, as well as a number of personnel from North Hollywood area. There was a vigil held for the unfortunate death of LA Sheriff's Detective Amber List last Thursday night, where her family gathered at the location of the traffic collision, and I'm thankful for our personnel standing there and trying to offer condolences and our support of the Sheriff's Department during their loss. On Wednesday, I attended a general membership meeting of the Southern California Cease Fire, where Mr. Skip Townsend and a number of other interventionists and service providers gather each Wednesday to talk about issues of gang violence, particularly in South Los Angeles, what responses or services are available, those strategies, as well as coordination and information with law enforcement. The effort there was to talk about, most recently, this investigation involving Metropolitan Division allegations of falsifying of field interview card information. There was a article in today's paper I'll just draw attention to with Miss Sandy Banks from the Los Angeles Times that was there during the meeting, and she provided some information perspective relative to the conversation. But I want to thank the Southern California Ceasefire Group or membership. I was warmly received. Chief Scott was there, as well as other members of the South Bureau Command staff, as well as was Chief Horace Frank. We talked a great deal about the California Gang Database, our efforts with the Office of the State Attorney General to modify circumstances and criteria of one being placed in that database, as well as it was an opportunity for me to explain the efforts and steps that can be taken to remove one's identity from that database. And then lastly, an overall discussion of the investigation into the allegations, serious allegations involving what started with 3 Metropolitan officers involving a stop in the San Fernando Valley. Later that week, I attended a recruit graduation. I want to thank Commission President Decker for being there as we welcomed our next academy class of men and women to the organization. Particularly proud of the work of OSS and Assistant Chief Gramala and her staff. That was a class that was well represented by particularly our efforts of deepening our bench and the number of sworn women that are coming into the organization. And it was also a group, as I moved around, that came from various parts of the country and across the world, actually, to join this department. And was encouraged by their energy and their compassion to make a difference in the life as they enter this profession of policing. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to attend the Martin Luther King Jr. Parade with the Commissioner Bonner. Thank you, sir, for riding along with me and walking a portion of the course. Well attended. It was a very festive crowd, and one that enjoyed a couple hours of walking and talking and seeing a number of community members. We heard a great deal of support and energy for our personnel. We also heard critics, and I think it was a fair opportunity for us to be present and to listen, and also encourage the heart. We had, I believe, over 100 of our personnel attending, many on their own time, and as a day of celebration for Martin Luther King Jr.'s his legacy and his spirit of challenging us as an existence to be for justice and equality across this entire country. Moving into the crime picture, this last week we did have our year-end crime report. Again, Commissioner Decker, thank you for being there with Mayor Garcetti. We reported the 2019 crime results. We are now going on the 3rd week of January for 2020, so these numbers are very young, very soft. But overall, we have seen a reduction in violent crime and property crime. We are about even with in regards to our homicides, with 11 homicides to date versus 12 last year, and 3 additional shooting victims this year versus last. So again, these numbers are very small and in a very short period of time. I'm not seeing any overall crime trend one way or the other at this point. So this more information as the weeks unfold. Relative to gang crime, we are also seeing a decrease there with 29 fewer reported gang-related crime, and which is about an 18% reduction. In regards to in-custody deaths, we had the 1 in-custody death that I just spoke about, compared to 0 in-custody deaths last year in the first 2 weeks of January. In regards to officer-involved shootings, we have experienced 2 officer-involved shootings, one with a hit and one with non-hit or non-strike. And of the 2, one involved a fatality. Again, this was a briefing that I provided last week relative to the circumstances of that officer-involved shooting. I will say that on Friday we identified the officer that was involved in that shooting and also posted additional information relative to a photograph of an object that was being held. It is my intention to accelerate the release of the 45-day critical incident video, and my goal is to have that provided with information based on as we know it today by a week from Wednesday. So that is ahead of our 45-day, but I do believe that the ongoing nature of inquiries relative to facts and circumstances of this case warrant the accelerating of that earlier release. I do intend that release to include 911 tapes, which has been requested by members of the community, as well as photographs of the item that was being held, and any other information I can that that can address inquiries by the public. Regarding traffic collisions, we're only 11 days as far as my available reports, so I really don't have any information here that would, I think, warrant discussion, other than just as we identified at the year-end press conference, hit-and-run fatals, particularly in South Los Angeles, is something that will be looking with our staffing levels, but also community engagement outreach to change this trend, troubling trend that we saw in 2019, which was year-over-year increase. Its impact in those hit-and-run fatals is primarily on pedestrians. Many of them are in the roadway, both during hours of darkness and sometimes outside of lit or crosswalks, designated crosswalks. But the area here of pedestrian being mindful of defensive walking, as well as the motoring public not turning an accident into a crime, is areas that we'll be focused on particularly South Los Angeles as we move forward. Regarding our personnel strength, we started a new class this morning, a new academy class, and we are today at 10,073 sworn members of the department, 3,009 civilians. We have a total of 389 reserve officers and 1,724 cadets. And that concludes my remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions or concerns.
Thank you. Questions from commissioners?
I just want to thank you, Chief, for your commitment to transparency on the Victor Valencia case and working to accelerate the release of information. Obviously, as the adjudicating body, we cannot form any type of opinion before we see all the evidence, but of course it's deeply troubling to learn that somebody's killed who didn't have a gun, and so I want to make sure that the normal due diligence is taken, and appreciate the higher level of transparency that you're providing to members of the community who knew and loved Mr. Valencia, and especially given that he was a member of our very vulnerable, unhoused community.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Bonner?
Yeah, just one. Chief, you mentioned, I think it was ceasefire, the meeting that you had with them, and I believe you had said that you walked them through a little bit of the process for getting removed from the gang database. Can you comment briefly on what that process involves, and just a lengthy process, and in cases where if someone is in the database as a result of department error, is it something that the department assist with, or just comment on all of the above, please?
So I'm going to keep my remarks brief. There is a full report coming before the commission I believe within the next 4 weeks that we've committed to based on our presentation last week. But in short, any member of the public who, first of all, has an inquiry of whether or not they're a member of the California Gang Database can go to a local police station and make such an inquiry. There's forms to be filled out there, and we will identify yes or no that they are that their identity is there. They do not have to appear in person. If they have an attorney or an attorney that's representing them, they can also make that inquiry by that agent. Secondly, if they are in the gang database and they feel that they should not be, they can also request to be removed. There's the same form that they fill out, and they provide the justification of why they believe they should not be there. That is reviewed, that is investigated and reviewed at the local station, and previously the captain of the local station was the final determiner of whether or not they would be removed or they would remain. As I mentioned, or not unknown to you, but I mentioned and committed to last week in meeting with Ceasefire, is that I'm going to be changing that to that appeal process will be reviewed by a bureau commanding officer as the final reviewer for the department's purposes. I believe that that added layer of a staff officer of the organization is warranted. Lastly, any individual who believes that they've appealed to the department and the department has ignored or refused their request can also go to court, and the court will, Superior Court, will hear their testimony or hear their account, and will make a finding and can direct the organization if they feel appropriate, the judiciary feels appropriate, to remove that individual from their membership on the California Gang Database.
A couple of just clarifications still in two cases. One individual comes to comes to the police department, and they say, I think I'm in this database, shouldn't be. Is the burden on them to demonstrate that they prove that they should not be in the database, or by raising the issue, does the department then take the effort of going through doing the review and making that determination?
Well, I think it's both. One could interpret the question both ways. The person has to step forward and raise the objection. So the burden's on them.
To do that?
To do that. Then the burden transfers to the department to review the facts and circumstances of the person's petition or their objection to being in the database, to determine whether or not their objections or their argument to be there will be honored, or it will instead be, no, we hear your objection, but we're going to keep you in this database. That decision is then reviewed by a lieutenant at the area level, area captain, and now I'm changing to deepen it to a bureau chief in one of our 4 geographic bureaus. In that decision, if the person will then be notified, and if the person still objects to their place or identity in the database, they can go to Superior Court and they can have a court decision. This is the process of this is codified within the State Attorney General's governance of this California Gang Database. The appeal process and the means of which one is pulled from it. But again, I think this is also an area that the report back to you on the California Gang Database can better provide context of the breadth and scope of how that database exists, its governance, its definitions, what it does and doesn't do.
And if it can also, in case, unless you know now, or address also the time period, like is that the process you described, does it play out over a matter of days, weeks, or is it a multi-year effort, that kind of thing? And also, are there situations where the department on its own initiative discovers the mistake and initiates that process of removing someone from the database that shouldn't be there?
Well, certainly presently for the investigation involving the actions of the alleged actions of some Metropolitan Division officers has resulted in us pulling certain database entries based on the allegations involving those individuals. So to that preemptive move by us, yes. The other matter is that the database is also purged, or names are removed based on inactivity and other. So those circumstances are a cleansing or a renewal of that database occurs through procedures. But again, these are areas that the governance of this, I think, fits to the governance of the database. And I think a written report on this in concert with the presentation can give better context.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about that. I'm really glad to hear about the elevated level of accountability in terms of the bureau commander making the decision. I wonder, part of what we talked about last week was, of course, the investigation about falsifying records, but I certainly am concerned, and I think others on the commission are concerned, really about whether the systemic issues in the database as it is designed. And as you put it, it puts the burden on the person who's entered into the gang database to go through this process to get themselves removed, and that is problematic in terms of, innocent before, or guilty before proven guilty. And the consequences that come from being into the database. So not to rehash all of that, because I look forward to the report, but I wonder whether we could, at the time of that presentation, have others present to us too, not just in public comment, but with an opportunity to present for a longer period of time and go more in depth about alternative perspectives on the gang database in terms of civil liberties, civil rights, and the consequences particularly for low-income people and people of color who are entered into the database, even if they're entered into it according to the policy. So maybe, I don't know who or all the leading experts, but certainly I know the ACLU has done a lot of work on this, and there may be others that we'd benefit from hearing from.
Thank you. Commissioner, I'd ask you to work with Mr. T-Fank to coordinate the day of that report, that perhaps we can have a portion of the meeting dedicated to those presentations, and welcome your ideas on the particular groups and experts who should be called. As a follow-up, Chief, when that report comes, or if you can answer today, you did mention that there's proposed changes happening and that you're in conversations, the department's in conversation with the Attorney General's office on that. It may be premature to talk about what those changes are because I understand it's a process, but I think it'd be helpful for us to understand what we can anticipate being changed. And also, as you described the appeal process, and particularly, going to court, I think that's a daunting process for a lot of people. But I wonder if the department provides notice to individuals about what the process is, that they even have the right to go to court. I'm not sure it would have dawned on people that they could go to Superior Court. So I'm just curious what the notification process is to individuals who are challenging, to ensure that, are they informed as to what the scope of their full rights are?
So two aspects. First of all, the proposed changes go to the entry requirements, what constitutes of the 8 criteria, and what those criteria, the definition of those criteria are. And our proposals dated August of this last year was to change a number of those criteria, we think, in quote unquote tightening them up, if you will. Secondly, as to the notice, the person as they're being entered into Cal Gangs is sent a letter from the department with the department asserting that based on information that has come to the department, we're entering them into this database, and in that letter gives them the process of contesting that. I will have to check on the notice to Superior Court. I don't want to speak out of turn. I do believe that's why I think this is a subject that, because the governance of this has some level of sophistication, I don't want to underserve it by speaking
understood, but if that could be part of the
absolutely, absolutely, the appeal process and full notice. Absolutely.
Thank you, thank you. Appreciate that, Chief. Any other comments from commissioners?
One last suggestion in the report that you're preparing. Maybe you're already planning, but if you can include in it any historical information really, so there's not just thematic as to what in theory may happen or may have happened, but and I'm not speaking of the investigations, I'm saying in the life of this database, have there been instances where people have challenged their inclusion in the list, and what how have those played out? And so comment on just really what the history of the challenges have been as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Assuming no other comments from commissioners, on the public comment cards, please.
We have 10 comment cards. The first 5, Adam Smith, Gina Viola, Akili, Jonathan Foster, and Tabitha Jolivet.
I spent time with Victor Valencia's family last night. I met some of his nieces and nephews. Victor was his mom's only son and his 3 sisters' only brother, and Victor had a 2-year-old son. In the killing of Victor, you said LAPD responded to a man with a gun, but I listened to the dispatch call. And your dispatch put it out as a male black with a small black gun in his left hand. Black man with a gun. This disparity in your own detailing of the incident is incredibly suspect, as Victor was, of course, neither black nor did he have a gun. The community has been demanding to hear or read a full transcript of the 911 call that prompted the deadly LAPD response, and I would hope that Police Commission sees the meeting of this demand as incredibly valid and urgent. The complete call, regardless of what the chief is saying, will be released next week. What's stopping it from being released today? Do you, police commissioners, the voice of citizens in police affairs, do you know the protocol when the LAPD shoots someone? Do they rush to administer aid to try to save that life? When Victor was shot, according to the LAPD PR Twitter account and Chief Moore here last week, Victor was transported to an area hospital in unknown condition. But like I said, I listened to the dispatch call. From the time when the officer said shots fired on the radio, 8 minutes elapsed before they even called a fucking ambulance. 8 minutes. I have pictures on my phone of Victor dead and alone on the sidewalk. This department, you, Chief, and your PR department are lying, and the community demands to see all video of this killing and the moments leading up to it. Not the edited video that Josh Rubenstein is going to release next Wednesday. All body cam, all in-car video, all video from area businesses. Do you all know anyone that struggles with mental health? I want you to picture Victor dying on the sidewalk and then picture someone in your life that you actually care about.
Can we just stop using the gang database already? I mean, seriously. People can go to court to have themselves removed off of the gang database? Are you being serious about that? I just can't even believe that that's something you take seriously in here as a solution. Stop using gang databases, laser, and predpol. Now, I'm so grateful to the Stop LAPD Spying Commission for doing the job of this commission, and often doing the job of the chief now, having to bring things to your attention that you should be responsible for overseeing. Metro officers who lied to put black and brown residents into the state gang database, we need the names of those officers. We need the names of those officers. We need to know what's happening with those officers. Are they still out patrolling the streets? We as the community are calling for an immediate end to the corruption, the implementation of structural changes, and accountability. You clearly don't have that. We do. Thankfully, we do as the community. And we want efforts to remedy as much of the damage that has been caused as possible by this. Inspector General, you said something about a complaint against the LAPD. I have heard in here year after year how many complaints are brought. Like, I don't know, 957. You know how many get substantiated every year? 0. Always 0. Every year I've been sitting here, it's been 0. Who is going to bring a complaint and think that anything meaningful is going to come of it?
Thank you, Mr. Akili.
Thousands of black people have been harassed and lied on. Thousands of them between 2015 and 2018. And we are demanding accountability. That's why last week when we came here, we asked for a number of things. The first is an attorney general, the state's attorney general, investigating this process. An immediate cessation of using the gang database, the disbandment of the Metro Division, and reparations funds for all those people that have been harassed, more than inconvenienced. Look here, we the only people in this country got to have a conversation with our children about what to do when they get stopped. I've had that conversation so often with my 16 and 19-year-old, they roll their eyes. They always say, Daddy, we know what to do. But I got to tell them all the time, they are at risk. They are at risk. My child, my sons, could be in that dang database. We are asking and demanding first accountability. Because without the accountability, they will continue to do what they've been doing. Without responsibility, they will continue. And without consequence, and that's the biggest thing, without consequence, they will continue. And if this was the first time, I would say, well, we'll give them a break. If this was the second time, I'd say, oh, man, that's a shame. But this is repeated. This is constant. This is regular. There is nothing you can do or say that will restore the trust that needs to be in these people when they do that. We have been unnecessarily harassed and then lied on once we got stopped. What do you expect us to do? In that gang database, disband the Metro Division, and provide reparations for the people.
Hi, Jonathan Foster. I'm the Bolero rep. You had a press conference, Chief, and was attempting to display some leadership. I know it's Native Americans' land, and I did pray to Jesus over the Bolero rap. But a few things you didn't talk about, and it's another crowded thing on the police belt, crowded belt. The suspects compromise balancing. It produces problems. Did you go over that? Like they could fall and hit their heads, got broken elbows, forearms, wrists, hands, palms, maybe a shoulder gets jammed up. They could fall forward, hit their knees, suspect falling into something that's stationary, and then they get hit, they're hurt that way. What if they duck and they get hit in the eye? You didn't go over this at the conference at all. What if they jump or spread their legs wide? I'm for this, but, may not work in a crowd. What happens if two of the Bolero raps are wrapped together? How much weight can they hold? How long is that? Something you need to know. But this is supposed to be besides the beanbag, the taser, and the gun, right? We're supposed to use a rap instead of the gun. Maybe they could try the rap to save lives, to not resort to the gun when possible. This is possibly becoming the new and improved LAPD. Maybe it's the leader in change and application in law enforcement for a better future. Maybe. We don't know. It's another tool. We don't know how it's going to, you got to do more tests and stuff on this stuff. So maybe it actually becomes effective. It's not the entire netting I was talking about, but at least somebody else is thinking like I was or before me, because they've already got this out and marketed and being deployed out into police forces for, possible use. And I hope that it really does, come in replacement of the gun personally. I mean, unless they're going boom, 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 maybe they shouldn't be shooting at somebody. God bless.
Thank you. Our next three speakers are?
The next three speakers, it's Tabitha Jolivet, the Red Chief, Paula Miner, Jamie Garcia.
Thank you. Ma'am.
I want to start by addressing just the pervasive hypocrisy, starting by you, Chief Moore, lifting the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I want to start with that. Because you've lifted his name, I'm sure you know that in 1968, Dr. King said, "The white man does not abide by the law. No, his police forces are the ultimate mockery of the law." Mockery is what we see in this room as we lift up the name of Victor Valencia and Albert Ramon Dorsey and Brendan Glenn and Brother Charlie Africa. Hypocrisy. And that hypocrisy manifests in so many ways. That's why it's astonishing for us to be in these meetings as you portray yourselves as benevolent first responders, when in reality what we know is a pattern is what has happened to the life of Victor Valencia. Stolen and re-victimized in the press by you, Chief Moore. Re-victimized when you've stolen his life when he was unarmed and poor and experiencing mental health struggles. You and your police murdered him, and you've yet to rectify the situation. How long does it take to realize that you were wrong? And what will you do to respond to that? You'll do nothing, in fact, and that's precisely what you're doing with this gang database, where you're falsely and knowingly entering in innocent people into that database who now have the burden of responsibility to get themselves out of a database that you control. A database where your officers are the ones who have knowingly and falsely accused people of being gang members are now the arbiters of truth about whether or not they are a gang member. They have the burden of proof now to get themselves out of that. That's hypocrisy. It's a sham. It's a mockery of justice. And so we demand as Black Lives Matter that you immediately cease the use of these gang databases, that you criminalize Black, brown, and poor people, the very thing that Martin Luther King Jr.
Thank you, ma'am.
The very thing that Martin Luther King Jr., whose name you dare to mention,
ma'am.
was fighting against. Y'all assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. for standing up for the poor, standing up against racism, standing up because of the military.
Please have a seat, ma'am.
You all perpetuate. Don't even say his name.
Ma'am,
Get
please.
his name out of your mouth. How dare you do that?
Red Chief Hunt, Paula Miner, and Jamie Garcia.
I guess everybody's still pissed off. Yeah. Hey, wait.
A man is dead.
and you guys got the right to be pissed off. 10 years ago, the Ninth Circuit awarded me probably $250,000 for 24 arrests. I have to say this. If you ever go watch Birdseed arrest or me getting arrested for littering or some other bullshit or me getting arrested for working and things like that, but it took 5 years to get it done. Today, in 2014, in 2011, they made the same mistake. They arrested me for free speech at a Parks and Recreation meeting and saw it in the newspaper and wearing a KKK outfit. Am I in the gang? Hell no, I'm not in the gang. It's how you define that. Number three is that 10 years later, after the decade, I'm still in federal court where they just awarded me a jury trial for 6 mistakes that you guys made again. Now, you think that the arrest level would have went down from 24 or 30 times it arrested me. It just went up to 89 times. I'm a true victim of what these guys are all talking about. Now, the jury trial is because you guys don't listen to what the law is really saying. You guys reframe it and do different things like that. But Michael Moore, the report is right here. I'm in jury trial again because you guys made 6 more mistakes. And the key suspects are Chief Beck and Matt Johnson. And it stems from this meeting, from you guys not recessing this meeting without a vote, and for you guys recessing this meeting and arresting people out in the lobby for being here, for me wearing that KKK outfit. Again, it's the same thing over and over again. No justice, no peace. You guys ought to listen. Just put me on the payroll, man, because, that's my only alternative. Red Chief Hunt.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Minor.
It's hard to get up here every week and listen to Chief Moore lie. To listen to Chief Moore just say whatever he needs to say to make an excuse for what's going on. One of the first things I just want to mention is that the regulations governing the gang database, as developed by the California Department of Justice, those regulations were under consideration during the whole year of 2019. Yes, LAPD submitted information in August, other organizations, ACLU, YJC, and we also submitted information to change the regulations to make them less subjective. The rules on how police officers determine whether or not you're in the gang give them excessive personal discretion. So the personal discretion is they determine what you have on, they determine where you live, and they determine who you associate with. But they do not put down any facts to verify or to justify. It's just, if I'm Metro and I see you and I think you are, and I'm putting you down. But one of the very interesting things with the California Department of Justice after the scandal was revealed about LA, the day for public comment on those regulations with the California Department of Justice was supposed to be December 30th or December 31st. After this information came out, they extended it so that all of us in the community had additional time to put in information because we knew more about how LAPD was failing us. And it's interesting to me that during that whole year, Chief Moore never brought to this commission to allow you to know what the regulations were for putting people in. And this was the same time that he already knew that his officers were doing something wrong. So, yeah, Chief Moore, you just lie. You just lie. And it's so sad. Don't talk about community trust. Talk about...
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Ms. Minor. Our last 3 speakers, who are our last 3 speakers?
We have Jamie Garcia, Audrey George, and Hamid Khan.
So, we talk about patriarchy, white supremacy, and settler colonialism, and because we're so governed by that, the onus is always on the people, to prove what is going on. But, time and time again, I'm going to keep coming here and I'm going to keep talking about this comprehensiveness in data-driven policing programs. And LA Times released a report or an article today, speaking about, the pressures that officers have in order to kind of prove data-wise that they are, doing gang suppression, gun suppression. But let's go a little bit deeper in that, because everything now is data-driven policing. We're waiting for the handbook to be passed out, data-driven policing with community input, whatever that means. But again, this falsification of FI cards. So again, I'm saying this is not just about the gang database. This is about the operationalization of databases. This is about how LAPD uses databases to inform other programs. So we talked about laser. We talked about the falsification of the chronic offender bulletin. Moore is now moving, probably because he realized he's now up against a wall. He can do nothing else. But here, in front of everybody, he said, I'm not going to do anything about the chronic offenders that were falsely put into the database. But now we're seeing that the FI cards that were even supposed to be being used were being falsified. So again, this comprehensiveness, this is a bigger issue. We need more investigation. So the last thing I want to talk about is community detection using spectral clustering of space geosocial data. FI cards informed this program that was being piloted in Hollenbeck with Jeff Brantingham, using FI cards to identify gang territory. This is a bigger issue. There needs to be now an exposure of every single program that operationalizes field interview cards. It cannot stop at the gang database. There needs to be an internal investigation to find out what else field interview cards inform.
Ms. George, and then Mr. Khan.
SB 392 is now law. The reign of terror on Victor Valencia, the stealing of his body, was against that policy. There was no necessary use of force by Sergeant Colin Langsdale in murdering him. You have to do something, Commission. You cannot continue to let LAPD investigate itself. And the OIG's office is totally incompetent or uncaring in that regard. You have to find a way to get independent people to do these, independent investigators and prosecutors to do these investigations. It's just wrong. If you think Chief Moore is going to do a fair and full investigation of Sergeant Colin Langsdale's shooting of Victor Valencia, then you live on a different planet. Those cops landed with expectations that led them to have their adrenaline up to shoot him like that. Just, we know LAPD, the black and armed, no chance. He had absolutely no chance. Shame on the OIG office. I wanted just to also mention that last week, Chief Moore said that he feared creating fear, animosity, and distrust among the public. What planet do you live on that you don't see that these things exist, that they're pervasive and well-deserved by LAPD? One other thing is I just want to mention again that this major scandal would never have come to light based on LAPD's self-investigation unless they knew that the media was about to expose it. Its consequences, those cops manufacturing gang database information and field interview cards, it's disproportionate and wide-ranging.
Thank you, ma'am.
Because of those false allegations, people were removed from their community.
Ma'am, your time is up. Please have a seat. Thank you. Mr. Khan.
I think it's a good idea, Shane, that you lifted that there should be a public hearing. And of course, there's definitely a whole lot of expertise in the community. I mean, I'm just thinking going back almost 40 years back in the early 80s, where this whole culture and this tradition of gang injunction really got started in Los Angeles. But I think what the coalition has been really lifting is that it is not just a programmatic piece that just comes out of nowhere. When you link with the history of Los Angeles, when you look at crack cocaine, when you look at the 1980s, when you look at the gutting of the economy, then you start looking at that what would policing look like of those communities, of particular communities, how the pathologization starts, how the demonization starts. So I think the whole language of gang and what it conjures up needs to be investigated. thoroughly investigated, because immediately the language of gang is not romanticized 200 or 100 years ago, the Irish gangs, but it's that demon black and brown body where the gang identification is assigned and attached. So it's not just about like we get done with gang injunctions or we get done with gang databases, that's going to stop. What the coalition has been lifting and constantly bringing back is that it is inherent, it is embedded in every aspect of policing, that how do you go and target certain populations? How do you go and target certain populations? How do you demonize the whole community? How do you create guilt by association? How do you pathologize that criminality? And that's where really at the heart of the issue is. So unless that narrative shifts, unless that this constant infusion of the gang identity in every aspect of policing is changed and shifted, this is something that we've been saying, as loud as we can. And that needs to move, because what's going to come out in this handbook, in the Predpol piece, is going to be another same old routine process of demonizing and pathologizing. So we look forward. So we want to see what those hearings would look like and want to bring up all these issues as well.
We'll move on to general public comment. How many cards are there?
We have 6 cards. We have Jeff Dilshad, Jonathan Foster, the Red Chief, Audrey George, Paula Miner, and Hamid Khan.
I did not get all that, but we'll start with Jeff.
Okay.
Sorry.
Good morning, Eileen. Thank you. I was sitting in the back listening to this lovely meeting with the ladies and gentlemen, and I was looking at your iconography, I guess, of the police commission with the scales and the stars and stuff. I was just thinking that that's kind of like a nice metaphor regarding equal application of justice between different groups. As you know, you had your child abuse presentation. A child obviously is less powerful than an adult. Perhaps a minority, black person or Asian or person of color, as they say, has less clout in society than a white person to some extent. Or rich and poor people is a kind of a classic power dynamic. I think that the metaphor supplied by your lovely public relations is giving you perhaps a direction to go in where you apply the law equally between the rich and the poor. That was some of my thoughts. Regarding child abuse, having been in jail, that is, I would characterize it as an abusive environment. I know you're not the sheriffs and you don't run the biggest jail system in the country, but you have your own little jail system. I think you could make improvements to make that a reasonably humane environment that would add to your credibility as an organization, and that might point the direction for other organizations to follow. Don't accept large $1 million donations from businesses in Los Angeles. I feel that that's a conflict of interest. I think that covers it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Jonathan Foster on the clergy, getting around the Constitution, the clergy, the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church, they call it clergy. The other they, the LAPD, they changed the words because that's probably a harder one to sell to the public. That leads to policy being changed. They go and they sit down, they have these heartfelt meetings with the LAPD, and then they go in and change policy. And they go around the taxpayer, they go around elected bodies and the established Constitution, you see. And it shows up like this. The clergy attempting to gain credibility where they were the ones in the recent past stating that the accusations that clergy had sodomized was untrue, actually was being covered up and redirected as untrue. So there was no way to bust the predators, but they all became criminals, even the LAPD. Now the Catholic Church, the clergy, want to appear as they have credibility, and they want that to be paid for by the taxpayer-funded LAPD, the credibility giver. The LA, we're going to sit with the cops and they're going to give us some credibility. Even though we were covering up, they were little boys' holes. When we all know that the real Jesus isn't going to give the Catholic Church any credibility. The Catholic Church is not getting any credibility from Jesus, God. He was in a cloud, he was in an ark, then he walked around in the flesh. He's coming back. He's not giving the Catholic poop, any credibility. I wish you would distance yourself from that body of whatever it calls itself, some sick thing. You know, when Christopher Columbus told him to go get some gold and we'll chop your hands off, you know? It's pretty bad.
The next three speakers, Audrey George, Paula Miner, and Hamid Khan.
What I was interrupted from saying earlier is the false allegations that are resulting from corrupt cops making false reports can result in people losing their jobs, losing their lives, being separated for their communities for nuisance abatement programs and stuff. It's got to be investigated and it's got to stop, and reparations must be paid. I also wanted to talk about something last week about the, and we were not able to continue the meeting. So LAPD was in agreement with Loyola Marymount for public sentiment survey services. I just want to remind you what a waste of money you are engaging in. You don't care about public sentiment. You don't care about our emails. You don't care about our petitions. You don't care about our letters and phone calls. Why would you spend money on a public sentiment survey? I wanted to talk also about something that that Moore he refers all the time to community meetings, such as, and then I read about one on January 11th. I'm interested in finding out what kind of outreach, who are you getting to those community meetings, and how are they finding out about it? And why do most community activists, even those that live in those communities, just totally never informed about them? And lastly, I wanted to just note that the LA Times in their articles have linked corruption in the LAPD to the predictive policing strategies that have been engaged in over the past years. And I want to thank, once again, Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Without their hard work, without them coming and truth-telling to you every week, these connections would not be made, people would not be having those conversations, and we would be in the dark. Thank you.
Ms. Miner?
More information has been revealed about the LAPD systems that encourage this gang database corruption. And recent information says that the Metro officers' productivity is measured daily, and the number of field interviews is an element used to measure their productivity. So these Metro officers were doing what you and your system wanted them to do. Now, you know, they cannot be excused because it's corruption, but we need to understand that was a system that was fostering that corruption. We have a man here that was entering information to affect the regulations governing database. At the same time, he was finding out that he had corruption in entering into that state database. So we want to demand that the names of all the officers who have been participating in that corruption be released, and their names go on that Brady list, the do not call list that's used by prosecutors. And I think all the names should be released because one name has been released, and we're aware of Officer Braxton Shaw was part of this current corruption and had been part of a previous corruption. So again, Chief Moore, you know, you respond to the press and you say, you cannot break the law to enforce the law. And I think if you're running around the community saying that, that's something you need to take to heart. And I think you need to have more honesty before this commission and before the public.
Thank you, Mr. Khan.
I wanted to make make sure that today's LA Times article about data-driven policing, that things don't get lost in translation, because while, you know, there's a lot being said right now about data-driven policing, but everything is data-driven. Let's make sure that, you know, this veneer of science and technology doesn't take over and misguide us, that as if history began with laser of data-driven policing, or it began, and of course, like, you know, the article digs into the corruption piece as well, because CompStat basically is data-driven policing. You gather all the information, you evaluate the information, you assess the threat levels, and then you deploy, you know, just troops out there on the ground. Suspicious activity reporting program is data-driven policing. Predictive policing is data-driven policing. Laser was data-driven policing. So I think now, since with this whole technology and veneer of science, just, you know, don't let the spin get the better of us, because the spin is on. And it's going to be this community-driven, data-driven policing, where now this 21st century and 2020, we're going to see this handbook coming out. So let's make sure that we are present. Let's make sure that we keep the pressure on, and for you all to fully recognize that data-driven policing is basically the policing. Where are all these bodies to be policed? Where are the communities? Redlining is data-driven, is driven by data. Segregation was driven by data, continues to be driven by data. Racial profiling is driven by data. So everything is data-driven policing. So let's make sure we stick with the reality and not put a spin on it.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, are there closed session items? Are there public comment cards?
We have no other comment cards on closed session.
Very good. Then we'll proceed to closed session.
Okay. The Board of Police Commissioners will now recess into closed session to discuss item number 4A1 in accordance to Government Code 54957.
Okay, the board is back in session. Madam Secretary, could you read out the closed session? We're not.
As to item 4A1, OIS 004-19, Board of Police Commissioners unanimously adopted the Chief's recommendations on the following areas: tactics, administrative disapproval, drawing and exhibiting out of policy, lethal use of force out of policy. Again, all three categories unanimously 4-0.
Thank you very much. Mr. T. Fank, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. We stand in adjournment. Thank you very much.